Objects in space gives players a starship and sets them free in a galaxy to do as they will, becoming traders, pirates, bounty hunters, explorers, and more. It's their decision what life they need, and what sort of complex ship they will have to build to do the job. Gamasutra sat down with Leigh Harris, co-founder, lead designer, producer, and Elissa Harris, co-founder, designer, lead programmer, of developer Flutter Games to talk about creating intricate starship possibilities, drawing from submarines to create those ships, and the challenges that come from creating a universe of content for players to create lives out of. Elissa, it was partly that while I have always been fond of sci-fi space opera, and enjoyed spaceships in games, but I was never that interested in flying Star Wars-style fighters. My favorite movies always showed big, slow capital starships, and I had not seen much of that in a game, Leigh, and I had often spoken about this. And it was when we began to think of merging ideas that we felt we had something pretty unique and cool on our hands. The idea of all the things we loved about a space trading game, combined with a naval ship-like combat system, really appealed to us as a space game. For those who are not action-which players, essentially, Elissa, I had been into submarines, ships, books, movies, and games for many years. They did always fascinated me. So, for me, it meant going back to my favorite sub-themes, such as Silent Hunter, Beyond Dangerous Waters, and asking the question, if you remove the restraint of simulating real hardware in a real environment, what design decisions could you make to keep the fun of this type of game, but smooth over the inherent advantages of a submarine-like combat and stealth system? In a sense, we were able to treat the numerous sub-themes that had come before as prototypes. What could we take away from each game? Positive things, negative things. How did we find the control schemes? And what would we change given the chance? Leigh, at first, we were terrified of how complicated we made the ships. It was aesthetically pleasing in a lot of ways, but man, tutorializing was going to be a huge nightmare. We had to write an entire prologue chapter for the game as a standalone tutorial that we were hoping we would not have to, and even then, we really only scratched the surface. But at the end of the day, we realized that as long as players can move their ship around, dock and undock, letting them discover how it all works for themselves was one of the greatest parts of the game. So, we included in-game help in the form of messages from in-universe hardware manufacturers, advice from friendly NPCs, and an in-game Infopedia, and allowed players to get into it at their own pace. It was very much designed as a sandbox, so keeping it open format like that enhanced the game, rather than detracting from it. We still found outlier players who felt they were dropped into the deep end, but we compensated for that by really taking our time before ramping up the difficulty. The game has time as a resource, so rather than have Tutorial Island, we have Tutorial Week, where the game takes it easy on players until an amount of time has passed, rather than until they have left some predefined borders. Elissa, it actually entirely came down a friend of mine saying, "Hey, I just got an Arduino. You have to check these things out. You can hook it up to a computer. Want to help me code for it?" I wanted to try interfacing with it just for fun, and the current project I had was objects in space. It made sense to play with that, as the idea of in my test console some LEDs under a few buttons to fire torpedoes, etc. was fun. It was not until myself, Scheurle, and Leigh created a full-on set of consoles for PAX Australia 2015 that we began to discuss ways to differentiate ourselves in a sea of indie games. We realized the fun of the hardware interface idea, and began work to formalize it as a game feature as we worked on the third set, which we did end up taking all around the world to show off the game. It did wonders for getting press attention and real engaged players at expos and shows an idea of what we were trying to achieve aesthetically with the game, even if they never built their own setups at home. One of our core pillars was player agency. We think of the game world as a toy box, more than a roller coaster ride. Options open up and up and up, so that players can dip their toes into whichever aspects of the game they find most interesting. There were no shortcuts here, no silver bullet to make it all work. We just had to refine and polish and refine and polish, which is a big part of why the game ended up taking 5 years to make instead of the 2 we did hoped for. We made 3 key decisions early on which opened a can of worms, but we were stubborn enough to see it through. Open world. The amount of content and balancing required to make an open world game work cannot be overstated. Naturalistic time always moving forward and dialogue never repeating expanded our workload tenfold. Submarine Simulator, such a complicated set of systems and mechanics, demanded similarly complex economies to make them all work, which again expanded our workload massively. There were heaps of other decisions, which made the workload larger than it had to be, but all of them flowed from those 3 key pillars. We have learned more than we ever thought we would about the unpredictable ramifications of design decisions at a concept level. More than we did care to name, we used countless forms of maps, which helped us plan out the game world. Our 13 writers start to see a map with geography on the X dimension, and time on the Y dimension, which we slowly populated as they wrote. Elissa and I were in charge of the major plot points which occurred, and reviewed new ones each fortnight. As we and the writers all turned out a new side quest storyline each fortnight as well, so writers could see the game world and its timeline unfold as they penned scripts for it, making characters' arcs as unpredictable as they are in real life. When we were done, those stories all got plotted out on a giant narrative map which allowed me to see whether there were any locations or in-game chunks of time which were devoid of content and ask writers to go and plug those gaps. Similarly, the engineering section had layouts drawn for every module and set of components, and those were stacked against one another to ensure each one was meaningfully different in terms of stats and cost, etc. And finally, the rollout of the systems themselves in terms of how they were revealed to the player had to be carefully mapped out such that players who wanted to rush ahead and learn everything had that opportunity, while those who found the game overwhelming were not pressured into learning too quickly. Essentially, it came down to having more planning maps and diagrams explaining the flow of the game world than we have had to do on any previous title. Elissa, it was very helpful. We did done it before with the previous title, but it was a largely finished game, design-wise, so I am not sure we got that much out of early access for that. By contrast, Objects in Space is a very systems-driven game, and during our 6 months in early access, we got to work with players, streamline, and even in one case, redesign underlying systems to make the game more fun. Even with our testers and the years spent on the game, when you get to see fresh eyes from players on your game, especially hundreds and hundreds of them, you really begin to see some of the things you can streamline about your design. We would not have been able to do that without early access. Ask any game maker what the greatest game of all time his and theirs, a decent chance they will say Tetris. Ask anyone how you organize an exciting, authentic competitive event around Tetris and you will probably get some blank stares, unless you are at the 2019 Game Developers Conference, where you will probably get a lot of strong opinions and some suggestions to go see the classic Tetris World Championship doc. Specifically, you will want to check out Tetris World Championship Building Explosive Esports on 8-bit Nintendo, a DD 2019 business marketing track talk all about the genesis and inner workings of the classic Tetris World Championship, which has grown since its 2010 debut to become one of the biggest modern Tetris events. Presented by veteran consultant and Esports commentator Chris Tang, currently a senior game designer at Hitsparks Games. This session explores how the CTWC aren 18 makes the most of old things, like NES Tetris, quirky kill screens, ultra technology, a passionate community low in toxicity, and high in intellect, attachment to growing gaming events, explosive memes, and having an amazing role model for a champion. This is a great opportunity to learn how the positive esports culture around the CTWC was cultivated.